Well, good afternoon and welcome everyone on this drizzly Vancouver day. Thank you for coming out. My name is Jens Zimmermann. I'm the director of the Houston Center over at Regent College, who is organizing this lecture by Raymond Tallis. The Houston Center, as most of you will know, is called the James Houston Center for Humanity and the Common Good. It's dedicated to the question of what it means to be human. Obviously, an important question since anthropology underlies pretty much everything that we do and everything that we believe. So we're interested in dialoguing with all manner of voices on the question of what it means to be human, what kind of anthropological structures are required for human flourishing in politics and institutions, in society at large. Now, Regent College, as some of you also know, is a graduate theological seminary. So our position from which we approach the question of human identity is rooted in the Christian belief of the incarnation. In fact, I call myself a Christian humanist, meaning that pretty much everything has to do with the incarnation and becoming human. According to a certain tradition I subscribe to from the patristics onward, Christianity is really about salvation. It's about becoming truly human. God becomes human so that human beings could become truly human. And therefore, Christians, in my view, should be interested to speak with anybody who is interested in humanity and who is, as Raymond Tallis is, defending humanity in some sense against reductionistic accounts of what it means to be human. So imagine for a Christian humanist how delightful it is to meet an atheist, secular humanist who really has the same goal. And Raymond has been very generous with his time and in our discussions and so on, and for coming out here. We've had a 2-day of exchange, philosophers from UVic, from Trinity Western University, from California, and here from Regent and Raymond Tallis hammering away at each other on what it means to be human, on explicitness, on consciousness, on all these things. So thank you for that, Ray, and thank you for the others. And tonight, or this afternoon, Raymond will talk to us about rescuing the self, the loss of the self and modernity, rescuing the self. What we will do is he will talk for about 50 minutes, and then we have a respondent to a lecture, Elena Holmgren from UBC. She's a PhD candidate. I'll introduce her after you've spoken. And then we have about half hour or so if you want to stay a bit longer for questions. And I can tell you that Raymond loves the dialogue. He loves the questions, and you can seriously ask him, I mean, within the parameters of rationality, and you can ask him anything. Like Raymond Tallis is not offended at, probing questions. We found that out. So, yeah, without further ado, Raymond, the floor is yours.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it is a very great honour to be here today. I can tell you, Jens met me at the airport on, I think it was Friday, wasn't it? It was Friday, yes. And we hit the ground running, and we've had the most marvellous, continuous dialogue since then. I've had the time of my life. And in fact, I've been here before. I've been to University of Victoria with Professor David Scott, and I've been Trinity Western and Regent College before with Bob Doty and with Jens. And when Jens suggested I should come again, my response was so rapid, my yes was so rapid, it was almost indecent, because I was so keen to come back, and all the things I hope for of this visit it's just been terrific, and we've had the most amazing dialogue. The only missing bit is I'm almost at the pearly gates, aren't I? Or at least almost at the gates of heaven in terms of my metaphysical viewpoint. Still haven't pushed open the door, but it has really been extraordinarily interesting, and the convergence of views between a secular humanist who's not a reductionist and somebody who has Christian religious beliefs is very, very interesting. And I've learned an awful lot, I have to say, in the last few days, and hopefully continue to learn in the next few days. So this is just saying I'm delighted to be here. Thank you. And regarding questions, I love questions and answers, so bring them on. My theme is, as you can see, rescuing the self, and you may say, what am I rescuing the self from? Well, we'll see in due course. But the aim of this talk is to make more visible and to explore key aspects of the mysterious creatures that we are given to ourselves to be. And I have to say, the more I think about myself, the stranger I seem. I may seem strange to you anyway for non-metaphysical reasons, but I have to say that I am, the harder one thinks, the less obvious one is. Oh, I beg your pardon. Oh, sorry. Did everybody hear all right? Yeah. Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, I think this probably needs to be switched on, perhaps. Oh. Can you hear me, Mother? Yeah, good. Super. That was always the punchline. Not at all, thank you. It was okay so far. It was audible, yes. So my wife says I have a penetrating voice anyway, so yeah. But it is a strange thing that I'm going to do with you, or am doing with you. It's oneself talking to other selves, reassuring or try to reassure them that they actually exist. And it's sort of, it is a bit odd that the more I think about it, the odder it becomes. And I really want to see what remains of the self when one denies oneself the use of certain terms, such as spirit or soul or ghost. And in particular, specifically, I want to restore what I've called the humiliated self, for reasons that have become obvious, to the point where that humiliated self actually becomes a person, the bearer of a biography, a moral agent. I want to exhume the self. And poor old Jens and the team have had to put up with so many puns over the last, and I fear it may not be the last one here today. So here we have our key witness, Mr. Bundle. Why is he called Mr. Bundle? Well, he has a rather interesting view on personal identity. David Hume on David Hume. I may venture to affirm that they are nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions, that's selves, which succeed each other with inconceivable rapidity and are in perpetual flux and movement. Nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions. And how does he arrive at that conclusion? He says, well, there are some philosophers who imagine that we are every moment intimately conscious of what we call ourself. For my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. But I can never catch myself at any time without a perception, and can never observe but a perception. So there's the autocidal tendency, killing off the self, as it was in the 18th century, but it's had a very flourishing history since, and in the current century there are some pretty prominent autocides, and I'll just briefly touch on them. Galen Strawson and the Pearl Necklace Self, Daniel Dennett, the late Daniel Dennett, on the narrative centre of gravity self, and Thomas Metzinger, the no-one self. So here is Galen Strawson. What does he think about the self? He says many selves exist, one after another, like pearls on a string, and they're rather small. A mental self, yes, exists, but only at a given moment of consciousness. In humans, it exists for a short period of time, just a few seconds. And here's Daniel Dennett, and what did he feel? He felt the self was an imaginary construct, a bit like the centre of gravity. And what he says about the centre of gravity is beautifully put and very penetrating. A centre of gravity, he says, is not an atom or a subatomic particle or any other physical item in the world. It has no mass, no colour, has no physical properties at all, except for spatio-temporal location. It's a purely abstract object. If you like, it is a theorist's fiction. It's not one of the real things in the universe, in addition to the atoms. And the self is very similar to that. It's a centre of gravity, or a narrative centre of gravity. But it is an imaginary thing. And then we have Thomas Metzinger, the man who is no one. No one, he says, ever was or had a self. All that ever existed were conscious self-models that could not be recognized as models. The phenomenal self is not a thing, but a process. And he sees the self as an illusory construct made out of our brains. So let's go back to the original sin, as you were, back to Mr. Bundle. Why does it look highly unlikely that what Mr. Bundle was saying is true? Well, the evidence is there on the very page in which he makes the argument for the Bundle self. What does he say? I enter most intimately, said in that quote, into what I call myself. I always stumble on some particular perception. I can never catch myself at any time without a perception, and I can never observe but the perception. Could a bundle of sensations really report in this way? Could it gather itself as the object of a report on itself? Could a bundle of sensations conclude that it is a bundle of sensations? might say, I rest my case, but there's work to be done yet. It takes a lot of self, the point is, to deny you have a self, and to be able to give and to share reasons for doing so, using words that have complex meanings. There is more, much more to Mr. Hume's self than what is revealed to him by introspection. And it's interesting, Thomas Metzinger, who doesn't believe in the self, his book on the self is 700 pages long. I think it takes quite a bit of self to shift that amount of paper. You may say, well, okay, game, set and match, let's go home now, but why bother with Hume and the post-Human autocides? Well, I think they create a standpoint from which it's possible by default to see what the self is. It helps to make visible the rich mystery of the self as something that is impossible to dissolve in the natural material world, which is the point of convergence between preoccupations that Jens and I have. So how do we rescue the self? Well, we need to look. We need to, as Wittgenstein would say, assemble reminders for a purpose. The road to rescuing the self is observing its deeply connected multiplicity. So where are the sources of coherence, of connectedness? Well, I want to suggest to you there is unity at a time, there's unity over time, there are standing states, there's the social scaffolding of the self, very important, and there's a small item called the body, but the body is not necessarily a total ally, as I'll explain. And then there's agency, the things the self has to do, because being a self is not just a spectator sport. So what about unity at a time? This is something that's preoccupied me since the year dot. But let's look at unity within a single sense, within a single modality of sensation, how it all adds up to a field. I see a landscape. In that landscape, I see a cow. I see some trees. I see a car moving. I see all those things together and separately. It's a kind of apperceptive unity, as Kant would say, even within a single modality at a single time. And then there's the cross-modal unity of sensations and perceptions. In other words, when I look at the landscape, I see what's before me, I hear the blackbirds singing, I feel the pressure on my feet, and all of those things all unite in this moment of consciousness. There is a unity of what philosophers would call transitive and intransitive experiences. A transitive experience is my experience of something else out there, like my experience of you, the audience. An intransitive one is like an experience of something like an itch, which isn't, as it were, about anything other than itself. It's not actually quite true, but it's good enough, near enough to be true. And along with that, there's the unity of the body in bodily self-presence. So already in this instantaneous unity, there is something very, very complex going on. It isn't just a bundle of those distinct sensations that Hume talked about, of hot or cold or whatever. And meanwhile, I'm looking at the landscape, feeling very sad because it reminds me of something else. So I have emotions. And then I think, what is it that's making me have these feelings? And I have thoughts. And then I have memories. And they all have, at the very least, philosophers contest this, but seem to have a common ownership, or at least a common point of attachment. So this is all what's built in to the unity of the self at a time. But of course there's unity over time. And this is one that many philosophers have emphasized, and I'll come to Locke soon and so on. When we have all sorts of memory, we have working experiential memory. This is the memory that enables us, as it were, to hold on to things so that we can feed our experiences into the next things that are happening and so on. There's the distinction between what's called declarative and procedural memory. There's memory for facts, say, which I can declare. Procedural memory, my being able to play the piano or ride a bike or whatever as a result of past experience. Memory for facts, memory for episodes in one's life, memory for episodes which we fit into our autobiography. And to me, the most exciting and interesting form of memory is so-called autonoetic memory. And it is very complicated. It's basically, I remember something about myself, and I'm conscious that that memory is of a time of my life when I was in the place where I had the experience that produced the memory. And so technically, we can think of such memories as having aboutness or intentionality simultaneously of many sorts. I locate the memory in a self that is myself in a world that is or was my world. I locate the remembered event in my life. I was there. I was. So it has what the philosophers call triple intentionality. I have the initial experience, which is about something out there. I have a memory of the experience, which is about the experience. And I then have a memory of the past self, which locates the original memory in a past, my own past. A very complicated relationship, just in a simple thing of remembering my going for the bus last week. Now, I've focused on memory, but it's not always a complete friend. And here's John Locke, the memory man. For him, identity was very much dependent on continuity of memory. But there is a vulnerability there, and he was aware of it. Because supposing you forget something completely, is it still part of yourself? And at times he seemed to entertain the opinion that if I forgot an act that I performed, it was no longer attached to me. I was no longer responsible for it. But of course, contra Locke, I can forget what I did, yet it's still I who did it. Also, the fact that memory seems to fade out, and that's been addressed by Thomas Reid, who was interested in what Locke had to say. And he says, yes, well, there's a kind of overlapping connectedness. Let's think of the example of a brave general in old age. He can remember the time when he was a brave young officer who rescued a colleague. What he can't remember is the time when he was caught stealing apples from an orchard as a boy and got beaten within an inch of his life for doing so. But the brave young officer can remember the schoolboy he was. So we have a sort of overlapping connectedness. The old general can remember the young officer, and the young officer can remember the boy who'd stolen the apples. There's a kind of sort of overlap, and this is a view that was revived by Paul Grice, who was a philosopher in the second half of the last century. He has a rather complicated way of putting it. It doesn't really add much, really, but he says, each total temporary state of a self contains an element. For example, a remembered experience shared by the preceding total temporary state. So my state on today, Tuesday, is, as it were, connected with my state on yesterday, Monday. But this won't be true of the total temporary state of different selves. So I can look back on Tuesday, you can't look back on my Tuesday. Where are we? Oh, yes. It's a sort of rather slim pickings approach to the self, in my opinion. You know, there's kind of continuity through overlapping threads. It's something that, surprisingly, Wittgenstein embraced. But basically, you get the continuity of the rope by the overlapping of the threads. But am I really a load of old or aging rope? It's a bit too bundly in a way, a bit like overlapping bundles. And the truth is that what overlaps in me at any time reaches past any definitive point of overlap. It sounds complicated, but I want to unpack it. I just want to go beyond what Locke and Grice and so on were talking about. Because there is a backwards and forwards connectedness, a co-presence of now and then, not only in explicit memories or explicit sense, but in implicit memories, implicit sense. There is a familiarity that draws on the past, and it has countless dimensions and scales. The self at any given time, of course, is fattened by its connected world. So there is an implicit unity over time, which is on top of the explicit unity which is affirmed through me remembering what I did yesterday, or telling somebody else what I did yesterday. The implicit temporal depth and the connectedness, and this is the key thing, that makes sense of experiences in the light of other experiences. So there's not merely continuity, connecting successive states or slices or contents, not merely overlapping threads, because the connectedness goes beyond discrete, explicit memories. So Raymond Tallis, that's RT, at time T100, is informed, facilitated by RT at time, shall we say, T1 to T100, what leads up to T100. My past and my present mutually inform each other. The sense that I and my world make to myself at any given time draws on the past and on a future that draws on it. So I couldn't make any kind of sense of my standing up, talking to you now, if I didn't draw upon a great, vast multitude of dimensions of sense. Behind every moment of making sense of myself is what I've called the sense light of prior moments and the intellectual and communal circumstances in which they lived, suffered, and embraced. There is absolutely no way I could make sense of what I'm doing now without drawing upon a vast amount of Raymond Tallis. And actually that's true of you as well, who are nailed to your seats. You too can make sense of what is going on at the moment in the light of many other aspects of your life. And we have, of course, a kind of ownership of one's past. We own up to one's past, and this is where we perhaps distance ourselves from Locke, because that past is still connected, and it's still available for us to be reminded of. Something like, as a medic, I made mistakes and regret them. I can still remember mistakes I made when I was a very junior doctor in 1973. I'm connected with that, and also one or two achievements. They're fewer than the mistakes. So we already have sources of coherence that make the self much fatter than any mere trickle or bundle of sensations. And then, of course, what you might call standing states, the body of factual knowledge we have, beliefs that are embraced, affirmed, enacted, projects that go on a long time, dreams, values, commitments, and most importantly, relationships with others. And there's other modes of unity over time. The deliberate acquisition of skills, expressed in one sense as muscle memory, but also as performance, the ability to teach others. And the exercise of those acquired skills as makes one a beneficiary of one's own past labours. Something called personality. It's something we may cultivate. It's something we may affect. It's certainly that which we act out. And that has important stabilities. It's not the only source of stability, of coherence, but it is an important source. So now we look beyond, as it were, the internal underwriters of being a self, and look to the social scaffolding of the self. And the central thesis of this bit is it takes a global village to raise and sustain a self. But that self doesn't dissolve into a community of minds. We don't just become a fragment of the global village or whatever, and I'll come back to one of the reasons for that in due course. But our social scaffolding is expressed in many ways: the roles, the rights, the duties we have, professed beliefs that we explicitly share with others, professed convictions, explicit commitments, relationship to institutions, and indeed something like our work as central to our identity. 40 years I was a doctor and so on, all part of both something that's internal to me, but is sustained and reinforced and affirmed by a social scaffolding. So when I went into the hospital in the ward, people didn't arrest me as, a trespasser. Nietzsche once described human beings as the promising animal, and a creature that is answerable for its own future. And behind promises is a very strong sense of the reality and continuity of the self. Even something as small as an appointment. Jens and I have been talking about this meeting, I guess, on and off for a year. Do you think, Jens? We first and we've had a date, time, month, which we've been heading towards, a location. 5,000 miles away, whatever it is from when I first spoke to Jens about it. Our appointments have topics, purposes, preparations, journeys, and so on and so forth. That's another way in which we are connected, appointments. And behind even the making and honouring of small-scale appointments is something that I've called post-tensed time. Tensed time is tomorrow, yesterday, future, past. Post-tense time is when it sediments into something like the 25th of December, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the time of the clock, the calendar, the journal, and indeed historical time, which again creates a structure in time against which, with which we are connected, and connected to ourselves. The role of the others is very important. It's very important to be taken for granted and to be recognized, so that, when I come home after this trip in Canada, I open the door, my wife won't call the police because, I'm a trespasser. I expect to be taken for granted. Hi, Ray, here we are. It's a sense of what is expected of me, our behavior, our attitudes, our duties, and of course, shared commitments, shared projects. So being acknowledged is absolutely central to the sense of self. It can't substitute for all those internal things, but it makes them more ironclad. And of course, there's a loop of reinforcement. We acknowledge those who acknowledge us. And it begins with the return of the gaze. We mutually acknowledge our temporal depth. And we do this in what I've called recreational co-curating of selves, as in memory. We affirm the reality of our past by sharing it. I just want to give you an example. I don't know about you, but my wife and I, we spend lots of time saying, do you remember when such and such? And it's extraordinary because the next thing is a pop-up shop. Oh, yes. Do you remember the face on the waiter when we asked for, whatever it was? Yes. And then you know what he did next? Suddenly you've got this pop-up shop, as it were, of things that we've both alighted on. This is a swallow. And we're all amazed, aren't we, that swallows, certainly in the UK, who disappear to Egypt for the winter, when they come back in the spring, they make their nests in the same country, in the same village, in the same house, and the same eve. You think, how do they navigate to get back to that spot? Well, equally astonishing is the navigation when I say to Mrs. Tallis, gosh, do you remember the look on that waiter when? I mean, we have to look through, let's say, 3 years of experience. It all has to become transparent. So we can then alight with absolute precision and set up this pop-up shop of reminiscence. So there's a very good example of what I've called recreational co-curating of the self. Do you remember when? We have a shared present, we have shared projects, shared concerns, shared commitments, a shared past, which is episodic, but also presupposed. It's what, Mrs. Tallis expects me to remember this and remember that. We have shared futures, and of course, we hang together, courtesy of those with whom we hang out. But the importance, I can't overstate the importance of being taken for granted, of being recognized. And along with that, comes a sense of what is expected in behavior, attitudes, and duties. We matter to another who matters to oneself. Again, this is mutually reinforcing. And it gives sense a substance that is not illusory, even if the content is sometimes mistaken. We can be nailed to our past self by shame or guilt, by mistakes, or even just by being impatiently awaited because we're late. I just want to touch briefly on possessions. The reason that I moved house not so long ago, and our aphorism for the house move was, we are possessed by our possessions, as we have to cart all our stuff from position A to position B. But also we're affirmed by our possessions. Don't touch that, you're sort of touching me. Our habitat as the many-layered clothes of ourself, a familiar world, the most local bit of a familiar world, all of which adds to the scaffolding of the self. There is identity, id entity, being that same thing, and there is the million mirrors in which we're reflected, in which we're affirmed as that person who is this person. We are documented, this vast scaffolding of our papers that are in order. So, to summarize that, it takes a world to curate a self, but it also takes a community of selves to curate a world. This may raise a certain amount of anxiety that the self is now starting to dissolve in the world. But of course there is a barrier to that, and that is the body, the ambivalent body. It is, of course, a kind of literal scaffolding of the self. It has the properties of being solid, localized, spatio-temporal reality. It does change, of course, but there is usual continuity. And it is, of course, the primordial, the initial link in our agency, the primordial mediator of our agency, and the elemental setter of the agenda of our agency, being hungry, and so on and so forth. It seems to be, in a way, more faithful than anything else in my life. and one body continuously present, whereas all other bodies, human and non-human, are intermittently so. I'm never separated from this body, but I see people, others, intermittently. It is, as it were, something that underwrites a continuous, distinct viewpoint, or I've always called it a view blob, because it's a bit fatter than a point. The important thing about the body is it stops the I from dissolving in a sea of we. That's with one E in we. And so that the self, as it were, doesn't dissolve in the village that curates it. We're always offset from others by our body. We have a necessarily distinct viewpoint which underpins a unique personal history. It insulates our individual narratives from those of others. And there's a non-fungibility of experiences. Your toothache couldn't become my toothache, or vice versa. So the body is an anti-solvent, if you like, if you were starting to get worried that the I was going to dissolve totally into the we. I am where my body is. And if someone says, the speaker turned up, yeah, his body has. And my presence to you ultimately depends on the direct or mediated proximity of our bodies. Maybe mediated by Zoom, but still there's a proximity. And this is the ultimate underpinning of the community of minds. Now, I don't want to go further than that, because there are problems with, as it were, thinking of the self to be entirely identical with the body. It's a philosophical position called animalism. First of all, it doesn't explain what you might call disembodied experiences, memories, thoughts, forward-looking emotions, values that are central to selfhood. And of course, there is a dissociation of the self from the body. We're always wool-gathering, and our gender is not always comprehensible in bodily terms. You know, looking at someone's body, you couldn't tell that they were running for a bus in order to catch a plane, in order to go to Canada, etc., etc. And there are problems, if we were to identify ourselves entirely with our animal body, of the communal aspect of the self. In other words, far from being dissolving in a sea of we then suddenly seem, as it were, so distant from the we of which we are a part. But the other thing is my relationship to my body is a bit odd. As a medic for 40 years, I've always been terribly aware that we have an incomplete colonization of our bodies by experience or knowledge. You know, my spleen and I haven't had a decent word to say throughout their life, and I hope I never get to know about my spleen. So there's much of our body that is simply we don't know about. There's much of our body that isn't colonized by our consciousness. Much that the body gets up to without my knowledge. There is a distance between its vita, its life, and my C, my curriculum. The fundamental divergence between the it being of my body and the am being of myself. So we've got to be very careful if we then try and make the self and the body, as it were, identical or even congruent. So much of my body is an impersonal it rather than a personal I. And people say, gosh, you know, I know this like the back of my hand. I bet you the back of my hand was in an identity parade, I wouldn't be able to tell which one was mine. I certainly probably couldn't tell the back of my head. Never mind my brain, which for some people is identical with what I am. So my body is a slightly ambiguous object. It's a continuous blob of flesh. That's the respectable side of it. It's also a smorgasbord of giblets. It's a nexus of guided juices, a trillion cells, a trillion atoms. So in a sense, to be identical with one's body, you need to identify, as it were, a privileged scale to define the mode of identification of the it of the body with the I of the self. And there are no such scales in nature, whether it's cellular versus molecular or cellular versus organism. Never mind privileged scales. So we can't rely on the body operating at a self scale of attention in order to underpin a self. So thank you, body. Stop me dissolving in the sea of we. But, you know, you're not the final answer or explanation of the nature of myself. Our embodiment is incomplete. But the body, thank you, helps to underwrite the unity, the continuity, the reality of the self. And what else do we have? Well, of course, there's agency, which has been implicit, really, in pretty well everything I've said so far. Because, of course, being a self is not a spectator sport. And action is self-affirming self-embracing. Action is amming, turning am or first-person being into action, especially where the action is effortful, where we put the self in italics. Action is rooted in long-term projects, depending on skills acquired in the past, is temporarily deep self-affirmation. Think about going to the gym. Why do people go to the gym? Well, they want to transform their body so that something unpleasant like a stroke doesn't happen 10 years down the track. This is a strange relationship to our body. But our days are shaped by the agency of previous days. So those wobbly times on a bicycle when I was 12 enabled me to ride a bicycle with reasonable safety 50 years or whatever later. An agency is incredibly complicated, drawing on many layers of the self. So if you think about running for a bus, to catch a train, to catch a plane, all of those things speak to, interact with, draw upon many layers of the self. Even trampling to a destination. The destination itself is defined by what one intends to do on arrival. And what one does on arrival makes sense that draws on many connected aspects of what one is. And there is, of course, the convergence with the agency of others at one's destination. We've agreed to meet for this reason, and so on. So being Raymond Tallis is in part doing Raymond Tallis. Hence, I am. Putting Raymond Tallis in italics. Effort is the reinforcement of the self. But I don't want to go too far. Unlike certain post-Kantian philosophers, I don't think the ego is entirely ago, or I act. So there we have it, the sources of the self. Unity at a time, unity over time, standing states, social scaffolding of the self, the body, and agency. Sorted. Not so fast. There are, of course, disunities in the ever-present, temporally extended, bodily underpinned unity. As a medic, I'm obviously very familiar with that, and I'm probably doing the practical medicine now as I get a bit older. And there are fundamental changes between the beginning and the end of one's life. There are inconstancies, and there are discontinuities. I'll touch only briefly on this. What about the fundamental changes between the beginning and end of life? Well, this is me in June 1946. This is not a selfie, by the way. And here I am. That's what I looked like in June 1946. And this is what I will look like in 20 whatever. That's not a selfie either. So clearly there's been some quite interesting changes in me between time A and time B. So changes, yes. And there's inconstancy. Things that mattered once no longer matter a jot. Having said that, the transition from mattering to not mattering has a story which we relate to ourselves. Why did we get over the passion for stamp collecting and so on? The story can be retrieved by the self. So I don't think the inconstancy, as it were, chops the self up into separate parts and certainly doesn't get it down just to a little bundle of separate sensations. There are important discontinuities. I mean, the most obvious one is the quotidian discontinuity of the nightly sleep. And I had a long email exchange with somebody who was very, very anxious, was totally convinced that the fact that he went to sleep at night and woke up the following morning proved that he wasn't a self. He was a series of self-slices. But actually, he wasn't. His Wednesday morning was able to resume precisely where Tuesday night left off. Now, he could regain his future self, or we can regain our future self after an interruption. Indeed, many of us setting the alarm, the self plans to ambush itself into resumption of itself. There it is, waiting. I've set the alarm clock so that alarm clock will reinstate Raymond Tallis. We redon our doffed body, we redon our surroundings as we surface, our acquaintances, our duties, our ongoing commitments, our stories. We have a new, unique capacity to do this. Okay, we fall asleep, but when we wake up, we reassume ourselves and cancel the interruption. I didn't manage to persuade, excuse me, the individual in question, but I hope I can persuade you. So, the self is more than a bundle of perceptions. Hume. I put it in question marks, actually, because some people like Galen Strawson and many years ago Nelson Pike said that Hume really wasn't committed to a bundle theory, but he's still a good starting point. The self is more than a series of time slices, Galen Strawson. I think you're wrong there. Nor is it a narrative construct, nor is it, as Metzinger would say, nothing. Of course, it's not a thing. It's not a stuff or a portion of stuff. There's no dollops of self. But it doesn't mean to say it's nothing. It's not nothing. After all, it is distinctive. It has an identity. In order to be not nothing, the self doesn't have to be a something. Oh, thank you. Cheers. Couldn't have a beer, could you? Was that I'm afraid I've got a very bad reputation while I've been here in Canada, the one who... in order to be not nothing, the self doesn't have to be a something additional to that with which it engages. So, is that the job done? Well, there's unfinished business, and there's actually unstarted business. I think the work of piecing the self together is a work in progress, and I think the talk has implicitly, without necessarily intentionally, highlighted the work has to be done. But I'm enormously grateful to the autocides like Hume and Strawson for really making visible the incredibly complex miracle of the individual who's talking to you, and indeed the individuals to whom I'm talking, for helping us to do what philosophy should always do, which is to untake the taken for granted, for seeing the mystery of human incarnation. One bit of unstarted business is teasing out the conceptual geography of the relationships between rival candidates for the role of the protagonist of this talk. I've chosen the self, but there is the I, there is the ego, and there's both workaday egos and Kantian transcendental egos. There is the subject, the person, and so on. And I think there's difficult work to be done to tease out that conceptual geography. But really, the more I think about myself, and the stranger I become, or feel I should become to myself. I might say, did I really need this talk? You've just had subjected 50 minutes, or whatever it is, of being told what you are, something you knew already. But in a way, philosophy is often in the business of correcting what philosophers have said. And what I've offered you also is, to echo Wittgenstein again, assembled reminders for a purpose. And more than that, celebrated this extraordinary creature that each of us is. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention, or at least for the courtesy of simulating it. So, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. I know for a fact that you're not a simulation. I now want to introduce the respondent. Ray has pulled you into the field of what's called phenomenology, and he does that brilliantly, which is a philosophy pioneered by a German professor in Freiburg, early 20th century, by the name of Edmund Husserl. And Husserl's goal was, by the way, if you wanted to read a really good criticism of scientism and all that's wrong with modernity on that basis, Husserl's book, The Crisis of the European Sciences, is still one of the best descriptions of that, was to break through the separation of mind or spirit from the material world, which underlies so many of our problems. So that a description of how reality reveals itself to consciousness, including our experience of the self, is a true description of how things are. And this kind of careful description that Ray has presented is precisely the sort of thing that reveals how phenomena, how complex they actually are. And so it was fitting, I thought, to choose as a respondent Elena Holmgren, who is a PhD candidate here at UBC. She studies under Evan Thompson, who has, similarly to Ray from a different angle, is working against reductionistic views of the self, and he draws on Buddhism, for example, thousands of years of Buddhist notion of the consciousness and experiences of reflections on descriptions of consciousness, to bring that into the area of cognitive science and research to see, to work against the reductionistic views of the self. Elena is working on the philosophy of Edmund Husserl and intentionality, and we thought it would be great if she could respond to Raymond for about 10 minutes. And it's also, I just have to say, for me, This is like a happy occasion every time we have a collaboration of different institutions. So to have Elena from UBC, have something put on by Regent College, have you come from Manchester, and the different disciplines is just beautiful. So Elena, if you could come and respond for about 10 minutes, and thank you for doing that.
Can I turn this off? Or close this? Okay, sure, thanks. Can you guys hear me here? I've never used a microphone, so it's okay. It's all news to me. Okay, so thank you, Jens, for the invitation, and thank you, Ray, for the wonderful, wonderful talk. The pile of ashes always cracks me up. I love it. Okay, so I guess I'll just delve in. Tallis' philosophical work is, in my view, most rewarding when it unearths and subjects to sober scrutiny some deeply seated presuppositions that have become for us part of the furniture of what we call the just obvious. Part of this furniture is a certain pattern of description and explanation that we have tacitly imported from scientific naturalism, which seeks to characterize the self and its primordial relation to being by analogy with physical objects, events, properties, relations, and causes. In his talk, Tallis gives a series of arguments that there is an in-principle mismatch between the naturalistic pattern of explanation and the explanandum phenomenon, the self. Throughout, Tallis's critique of naturalism is based on a pattern of argument that I think can be traced back to a lineage that runs through Thomas Nagel, the explanatory gap guy, the qualia guy, the what it's like to be a bad guy, and back through phenomenologists like Husserl, all the way back to Kant. And it is the consequence of Tallis's tapping into this lineage that my comments will explore. Tallis argues that the objective methods of science cannot, in principle, be suited to the task of rendering the self fully intelligible to itself, since the self is not an object. That is, the self in its minimal form or essence cannot be fully disclosed or thematized, as Husserl would put it, as an object, either of introspection, as Hume tried and failed, or of empirical inquiry, as neuromaniacs, as Tallis calls them, also try and fail. This is because there is a disanalogy between the unity of the self and the unity of objects, like brains and crystals, that fall within the possible scope of empirical methods. The unity of the self, unlike that of objects, is fully disclosed only from the first-person perspective of the subject, I am. Adopting this perspective discloses the self as that which makes it possible for any object to become intelligible, or as Tallis puts it in his other work, explicit. From the first-person perspective, the self is disclosed as neither a thing, as Tallis points out, nor a nothing, but rather as the foundation of all possible knowledge of objects. Moreover, the foundation for all knowledge of objects cannot itself be an object, since the latter presupposes the former. This is ultimately why the pattern of explanation that works for objects doesn't work for the self. This is why you cannot derive the self from objective facts that are taken to be more fundamental than it is, in the way that the reductionist accounts targeted by Tallis try to do. This is also why the basic pattern of trying to explain the unity and continuity of the self in terms of third-person facts about objects, like the brain and body, must fail, and why appeals to possible revolutionary discoveries of future science or neuroscience or biology wouldn't work to bail out the naturalist in this case. You can see this line of reasoning at work in Tallis when he argues that the specification of the bounded unity of objects, like the brain or body, can only be done under a description, right? This again presupposes the presence of the self and its work of describing or making explicit. Moreover, as the condition of possibility for explicitness as such, the self cannot be explained as itself an explicit content. Whether as a Humean bundle, Strawson's string of pearls, Metzinger's neural self-model, or whatever other complex product of scientific theorizing we may wish to reify objectify, and treat as the explanatory ground from which we are to derive the reality of the self. It is with this argument that I feel that Tallis goes transcendental, right? In a manner that is strongly reminiscent of Kant, or Husserl for that matter. Recall Kant's argument for why a synthetic unity of apperception, or an I think, must accompany all possible experience or representations. So Kant argued that a necessary condition of possibility that explains our ability to compare, contrast, and otherwise relate a series of mental states is that they must each appear as possible states for the same self-conscious subject. If they did not appear in this way, we would not be able to explain our capacity to abstract ideal contents like the truths of mathematics or of logic from sensory contingencies and to connect these ideal contents across time into inferential chains, like my talk right now, which you're following along nicely. I hope I didn't put you to sleep yet. Kant tends to put people to sleep. Moreover, as Tallis reminds us in works such as Seeing Ourselves, one cannot derive the consciousness of temporal succession from the contents that are in succession, so the flow of time, right? You can't derive that by looking at the things that are flowing in time. Now, the self as the principle partly responsible for the consciousness of succession must be of a higher order than the psychic contents in succession. Thus, the self-conscious subject is the structuring principle to which we must tacitly refer whenever we wish to individuate experiences as systematically coordinated or unified in succession. Science itself would not be possible without the evidential base provided by the systematic experiential coordination. Ultimately, that self-consciousness is tacitly involved in all possible object consciousness is what I take to be the key lesson of transcendental philosophy of mind following Kant. And I see Tallis's project of rescuing the self as a reminder that scientific naturalism has failed to internalize the founding insight of this transcendental tradition. So this entire labored argument I just gave you so far, that every knowledge of an object presupposes a knowledge of the self. I think the object. That's what makes it possible for me to think about objects. Now, given the status of the self as a foundation for all possible knowledge and explicitness, including the scientific variety thereof, we can understand why when we attempt to gain traction in our project of philosophical self-understanding by adopting the naturalistic starting point, we are moved in spite of ourselves to adopt an autocidal tendency of thought. Tallis's analysis here echoes that of Husserlians such as Dermot Moran, who argue that scientific naturalism is based on a performative contradiction, where this is understood as a statement the explicit content of which undermines or contradicts the presuppositions we implicitly rely on in formulating the statement. So this involves us in a kind of practical and existential incoherence that goes deeper than mere logical contradiction. Now, to see this, consider, per impossibile, like impossible, but consider just a thought experiment, what it would be like were we able to carry the project of naturalism to its fullest possible consummation and construct a so-called theory of everything, right? Now, note that even such a theory of everything would presuppose, right, and thus fail to include or explain, right, an account of the first-person subject that sustains the movement from what is, mere being, uninterpreted, undescribed being, to that it is, or explicitness, as Tallis talks about in his other work. Now, this means that the theory of everything, if true, describes a world in which no theory of everything could ever emerge, a world without theorizers, right? Now, naturalism is autocidal insofar as it violates the general conditions that make possible coherent perspective taking, and one of those is self-consciousness, right? The key issue we are left with, once we have uncovered the autocidal tendency of naturalism, at least in its more dogmatic ontological variety, as the sort that Tallis has been nicely describing here and attacking rightly, is now to figure out what sort of ontological commitments, what sort of metaphysical commitments, if any, follow from our acceptance of the transcendental status of the self as a general foundation of knowledge and meaning. What can we infer about what the self is from this account? What can we, like, we know that naturalism can't be right. So what must the self be to make possible scientific knowledge, or self-explanation for that matter, the entire project of self-understanding? So there are some, like Jack Reynolds, so I'm bringing a kind of competing account here. So there are some like Jack Reynolds in his book Naturalizing Phenomenology, who adopt a kind of pragmatist and deflationary reading of the transcendental subject that I think Tallis's account is circling around here. Because I think the self has to be a transcendental subject, unbeknownst to perhaps Ray, in order to do the kind of explanatory work that Ray seems to, in order for it to function in his critique of naturalism as Ray thinks that it functions, right? So now Reynolds argues that a philosopher called Merleau-Ponty has shown that the dependency of the transcendental process of making explicit or coming to know or of describing on empirical bodily historical contingencies, which would make transcendental structures like self-consciousness and intentionality and agency, the key structures of the self, historicized and radically relativized on his view. Now, crucially, given this kind of relativized notion of the transcendental, I think that the kind of transcendental arguments that I take Tallis to be deploying in his critique of naturalism cannot establish necessary conclusions, but must instead be taken to be contingently justified. But if this is the case, then these arguments cannot rule out in advance the possibility of a reductive explanation of the self as neuroscience progresses, and we discover some kind of magic structure that perhaps will effect the reduction that Tallis wants to argue in principle cannot be affected, right? So then we end up actually providing a reductive account of the self. Indeed, Reynolds uses his deflationary relativized conception of the transcendental to argue for a kind of naturalizing of the conscious subject, for collapsing, for sort of a methodological interdependency between transcendental arguments, transcendental philosophy, like what Tallis, I think, is doing here, what I've just been describing to you, and empirical cognitive science. But I think that it's unclear that Tallis's rather robust reading of the transcendental status of the self as a condition of possibility of knowledge would hold much force against those like Reynolds who accept his basic transcendental argument, but do so under this kind of deflationary interpretation, by seeing the transcendental perspective on the self as just one more useful, but in principle revisable, right, tool that we can use to describe the self, in no way privileged, right? So this would mean that maybe we could use empirical neuroscience to ultimately reduce this account. Maybe we could have a purely empirical neuroscientific account of the self qua foundation of possibility of knowledge. But I think that Tallis doesn't want to say that. Like, he wants to block that kind of reductive argument. Now, it seems to me that Tallis has some more work to do in bolstering up his robust interpretation of the transcendental status of the self. An interpretation that I think he crucially relies on in his critique of autocidal naturalism. However, I suspect that that further work may lead Tallis perilously close to the sort of transcendental idealism that he seems to distrust. Thank you for your time and attention.
Many thanks, Elena, for telling us that Raymond should really be a transcendental idealist. And I think we should give you a short chance to respond to that criticism, if you could. Yes, and after that we'll open it up for questions. I just want to know, do you want to field your own questions, or do you want me to, when you finished? Okay. Okay, brilliant. We have a microphone for the questions. John Nolan here will go around and just raise your hand if you ask a question. And if I could just ask the participants of the last 2 days in discussions, if you guys could just hold back and give other people a chance. Yeah, because we're already warmed up and ready to jump in, but you know, just, anyway, Ray, if you would like to respond to whether or not you failed.
Elena, that was absolutely beautiful, and of course thou hast found me out and known me, because there's that next step, which could theoretically, if I really want to insulate the self from naturalism, or indeed from sort of swept up bundleism, I really need something to bring the self together, and that is likely to be something like query, a transcendental ego. So you're absolutely right. I think your conclusion is I've got more work to do. My head scratching, that's why I'm almost bald from scratching my head, is basically that to know how to make that jump without taking on board other aspects of Kant, which I do feel, as you know from our discussions the last few days, I'm uneasy about. But I think you set my agenda for the next stage absolutely brilliantly, so thank you for that. Yeah. No.
Ready for questions, Ray.
So, first of all, thank you for your talk.
Thank you.
In which you mentioned Thomas Reid.
Yeah, I did.
That, if I'm not mistaken, is the philosopher of common sense.
Absolutely, yes.
And
at least thus he presented himself.
Okay,
yes.
and I think that's the weapon that we have to demonstrate the existence of self is probably the best weapons that we have is actually common sense. But my question is going to be a bit more theoretical. And I would like to ask you if you have given any thought to the relation between the self and what Jung calls the collective unconscious, if you find any.
Yeah. I mean, I read a lot of Jung way back when, and I wasn't entirely persuaded. You know, some of the things Jung said seemed to be, yes, quite true, but he had these vast syntheses, which I thought he was just going off on one, really. And so I'm afraid I'm not a Jungian. It may well be the case that I've always had a problem with the variants of psychoanalysis, and so some of the problems I had with Freud spilt over into a little bit of my prejudice against Jung. We do have a sort of community of minds, that's for sure, and that has historical depth, that's for sure. And if Jung was confining himself to that notion, that would be fine, but it's the way he goes off on other things that I find he's too fond of spooks, really, you know, so that's what this is my racking my brains from reading him, you know, 150 years ago. So, yeah.
Hi. Got another psychological question for you. This is something I've been trying to figure out myself for a long time, so I'm curious about your own thoughts here. I always wonder about the phenomenon that people have where, for example, they might experience themselves with having multiple selves, like multiple personality disorders or something like that. And there seems to be a bit of a psychological phenomenon where that can be an experiential thing, as in sometimes you can fix that by, you know, therapy or something like that, and then you have an integrated self. But I would wonder at some point they must have had different selves, and that may even be like a real experience and in some ways like an ontologically true statement. But then there's an interesting opposite phenomenon where people, for example, have a continuous sense of self with a literally split brain, and this is something I can't resolve. I don't understand how those two phenomena can sort of exist in the same space. So I'm wondering if you've given any thought to the kind of these psychological experiences. Yeah.
I mean, I can speak with more authority about split brains. I mean, the stuff that, Roger Sperry got the Nobel Prize for, just to fill anybody in who doesn't know, there are some people with very severe epilepsy, and the only way to cure it was to basically make an incision between the two hemispheres of the brain. And post-operatively, those individuals seem to be unified single people. But if you do very clever, subtle tests, you can see that they can perceive things with one hemisphere, that they can't perceive with another. And that was blown up to the notion of they had split selves. But actually more recent work, published in 2018 in Brain and so on, has shown really they have amazing unity of most things. So it can only be pulled out by very subtle experiments. And so in a way, I don't feel there is this problem of the split self, of the split brain producing as a split self. I'm a bit out of my depth when it comes to the multiple personalities, the multiple selves. It seems to me what little I know about it, those individuals still have a lot of continuities. They go to the same doctor. They'll have the same assumptions. They'll have the same presuppositions. They have the same skills, body of knowledge, and so on. But there are certain ways in which they are absolutely clearly broken up. That bit I don't understand, but it does seem as if the multiplicity of the self doesn't divide all the way down to the bottom of the self. And I got a feeling you probably know more about it than I do, but are you persuaded by that description?
Yeah, I think it's more, I guess in some ways I think about the causal split, in terms of often we think of the self as being like a continuity of neurons during the neuroscientific viewpoint. But then the split brain, as far as I'm concerned, actually is the counter-argument to that, right? Because there's clearly like a physical causal link, but as you're sort of saying, people will experience themselves as a whole self. But then there's a strange opposite. So I don't have a resolution. It's just what's
No.
I find these to be curious counterexamples of something.
Yes, yeah. But certainly I felt Roger Sperry's original experiments were grossly overinterpreted. And I think that's the general feeling now, because they can't take the Nobel Prize back. Oh my God, is the tape on? I mean, they can't take the Nobel Prize back, but it just seemed to me that it was a good example of what Elena referred to as my obsession with neuromania, which is neurological explanations of everything that's human. And it was a sort of neuromaniac interpretation of the split brain patients.
We were talking earlier about Charles Taylor, and I noticed a gap in your talk about the relationship of the self to the moral good. I don't know if you've looked into that at all, but his book, The Sources of the Self, really works on that quite vigorously, and I just wonder if you have anything.
Yeah.
I know it's hard to cover everything, but I wonder if the idea of the moral good, the objective moral good, because there's a subjective relationship to the objective moral good, and do you want to comment on that?
Oh, well, thank you. I mean, he was the elephant, obviously not in the room, as you were. On the other hand, you don't bring coals to Newcastle. You don't go to Canada to talk about one of the greatest Canadian philosophers. They know about him already. So in that sense, but I mean, and of course his book, Sources of Self, it focuses first of all on ethics and morality and so on. And a lot of it is about the evolution of the self seen through the collective consciousness of humanity in different epochs and so on. So it's a mighty work of historical scholarship. I was focusing much on sort of lower grade stuff in a way, I guess, like all the extraordinary things that are mobilized just in being taken for granted by someone. And that to me is quite shivery stuff, or turning up for an appointment long before we get to the higher level of the sources of morality and ethics and so on. And I guess he's covered that territory extremely well. Yeah. Hence his absence from the talk. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh. Will.
I'm interested in the emergence of this concept of the self. Two questions. One is, you mentioned in one of your books that contemplation of the hand, of the opposable thumb, being able to be observed and giving action to not just movement, but propulsive action, you thought was somehow related to the development of a sense of self and consciousness that distinguished us from the higher primates. I just wondered whether you've done some more thinking in that direction.
Yeah.
And my second question is whether you enjoyed speculations like those of Bernardo Castro, who talks about a kind of a universe of consciousness of which our individual consciousnesses are just like little whirlpools in a large river, and whether that has been that source of amusement for you.
Yes, I mean, I shall have to handle my words carefully. I talk Bernardo Kastrup, and shall we put it this way, his very, very big ideas seem to be poised on a rather small database, but I'll leave it at that. You mentioned the hand. Basically, one of the great puzzles, if you come from a naturalist viewpoint, is how did we humans come to be so different from our nearest primate kin, who have a kit pretty well like ourselves? Can there be any kind of biological explanation of how, I am so different, even from the brightest chimpanzee, different world, and so on, or living in a different world? And the book that Will's referring to was part of a trilogy called The Hand. And in the Just So story, I tell of how we got from, as it were, being just primates amongst primates, as opposed to primates into pares. I basically gave the hand a central role, upright position which liberated the hand, gave vision, a distance receptor, a priority, but most importantly, our hand was liberated from being just a locomotor prop to being an extraordinarily important cognitive structure. And because of the quite different anatomy of our hand, fully opposable thumb, fractionated finger movement, be able to do things like this, that hand became very important to our further development. Aristotle, this is the least original thought I've ever had, because Aristotle got there before me. He's talked about the hand being the tool of tools. So the hand has had a central role in the development of our immediate and mediated agency, combined with the other things. So I sort of felt slightly obliged to have a biological account of how we got further and further, as we do, from biology, given that chimpanzees have quite a complicated consciousness. And have a lot of the kit that we have. So that was essentially the story, yes. Yeah.
And I wondered whether looking for something higher up than neurochemistry and bouncing around with molecules in the brain and the flux of ions across cell membranes and things like that, whether it wasn't just a kind of a sort of a retreat higher up the scale toward the hand, and looking for something that distinguishes the lower animals. Did it seem much more convincing than those people who claim to find our distinctive features in one set of wirings, to unite, up to the frontal lobes or something?
i.e. brain size or whatever. Actually, brain size in terms of brain to body weight ratio, we're not absolutely so far ahead of the pack in that sense. It's just that basically there then becomes an iterative relationship between the hand and the brain and the hand. It becomes a sort of positive forward loop. Having said that, I'm still totally puzzled to know what to do with the brain. I mean, it's obviously a necessary condition for all the things we are. Chop my head off and I stop lecturing. Oh, you may think that's a way of bringing the thing to a halt, but I do, at the same time. So the brain is obviously a necessary condition for even our most complex consciousness, our thoughts and so on and so forth. And there are all sorts of very detailed neuroscience which shows a correlation between neural activity and some of my experiences and even certain thoughts and so on. Epilepsy was one of my specialist interests as a doctor, and it's perfectly obvious if you have vast discharges across the brain, you will lose consciousness, and if you have localized discharges, you get localized symptoms. So all of that indicates the role of the brain as a necessary condition of the kind of creatures we are. But there's still a gap between what happens in the brain and Raymond Tallis. That ions passing through semi-permeable membranes don't seem to bring us any nearer to even simple things like me seeing Jens now. Yeah. And I think this is really seriously unfinished business. Deal with the gap between the brain as a necessary condition and the brain as a sufficient condition. Yeah.
Question in the back.
Yeah, thanks again for the talk. You pointed to this at the end. I was just curious if you could say a little bit more about this language of personhood. I'm sure you and Jens have discussed this. But when you're saying a human is a self, and then the maybe similar but not totally synonymous language of describing a member of the human family as a person, where would you see that language fitting into your project, or does that involve additional commitments?
Oh, thank you. I think it's definitely part of the not merely unfinished but unstarted business, because I focus on the self because that seems sort of low-hanging fruit, easy pickings and so on. But I think the notion of a person clearly goes beyond that of the catchment area of the word self. And there is the notion of the I, and I think Elena's talking about the ego, and in particular the transcendental ego. I think there's just work to be done, I'm afraid. I find it difficult to sort out the conceptual geography of all of these terms. So I fess up, basically. Yeah, but it's a good question.
I wanted just to ask about
how mystical experience, the blurring of the boundary between the self and the not self, whether thought of as in brain terms sort of chemically induced or religious experience, but how that factors in. Is that like other forms of consciousness like sleeping and dreaming, that you return to the kind of consciousness you're talking about, but whether that is a phenomenon that factors into your thinking about the nature of the self?
Yeah. I mean, it seems to me one needn't sort of go to exotica to look at the profundity and strangeness of the self. So the fact that, I can remember something that happened 3 years ago. My wife and I talk about it, we create this pop-up shop. That's, to me, mystery enough. I haven't tried any drugs that would transform myself in that way. I did once smoke some pot and got a sore throat, but that was when I was about 16. So I can't really comment on either drug-induced mystical experiences or mystical experiences that occur for other reasons. But for me, just ordinary experience is deeply mystical. Yeah.
It seems so far in our discussions of the self that it's all been rather contained. That is, we're speaking very strictly of the I in the first-person perspective. But it seems to me one of the great mysteries, and I think you perhaps touched on this, of being a self is that I can't really become myself without having myself given back to myself through the other in some way. So through the vast network of my relations, I can't be the self I am without kind of the history of myself with other people. I wonder what you might have to say to that intersubjective experience.
I think it's absolutely central. I mean, this is, it takes a village to curate a self. It takes a village to raise a child, this sort of say, and it takes a world to put a self together. It's a world within which we're in dialogue. But have I sort of, just say that question again, because I got a feeling I'm moving to one side of the question.
Sure.
Yeah.
It's just, in the talk itself, it seems as if the discussion itself is very locked away, our experience of things. So I'm thinking of kind of the category of recognition.
Absolutely, yes.
How that kind of comes, how we give ourselves back from the other, so to speak.
And that appeared late in the talk, but it wasn't a reference. No, it is absolutely central. Being recognised. There's a marvellous novel by Emmanuel Mounier called *The Moustache*. I don't know when anybody's read it. It's an extraordinary story. Jens, do you? I mean, essentially, this chap decides for a prank he's going to play on people. He's going to shave off his moustache, and he's had a lovely, luxurious, Nietzsche-type moustache, something. So he shaves it off, and nobody notices. And then his wife denies he ever had a moustache. And slowly but surely, he completely, totally unravels. So without that reciprocated acknowledgement, the self then becomes sort of a bag of cognitive goodies, which is sort of losing its value. Yeah. So your point is completely to the point. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for a marvelous talk and a very broad, sweeping survey of different ideas of self and selfhood, personhood. Apropos to the question that was just asked about self and personhood, I wanted to follow up and your response to that question and ask about, in terms of mapping the territory of these conceptions that you've kind of put out there, whether you might speak to the idea of identity as a uniting factor amongst these things. When we talk about social identity, we talk about personal identity, we talk about the self, we talk about a unity, we talk about all these different things, and they seem to be united by the idea of identity. And psychologically speaking, I wondered if you might also append your response to talk about how it is that we identify with particular aspects of what we are and disassociate ourselves from other aspects of what we are, and how sometimes we take those aspects that we identify with as being the true self and other things as not actually being essential.
I think that's a really good question. Thank you. I mean, it's interesting that I was quoting Hume, but the passage came from a section called Of Personal Identity. He only then pitches into talking about the self. So there's obviously a very porous boundary between the notion of self, identity, ego, and so on and so forth. So there's it's a complex conceptual geography. Clearly there are moments when the self appears as identity, when our papers are in order or not in order, when we present our passport at the border, all of those things, then you're, as it were reduced to something that is appropriately attached to a name and a set of rights and so on and so forth. But I guess the self seems to be the sort of fat middle of it all. with others on the side. But although that doesn't mean to say I'm ignoring what Elena said, because clearly the ego and the transcendental ego in particular are sort of hovering in the wings, waiting to hoover everything up, possibly. I like, what you said about we affirm parts of ourselves and deny parts of others, or think the real me is this, something rather better than the real me, actually. We tend to identify with bits of ourselves, give them headlines, they are central, and so on and so forth. That's part of our agency, isn't it? One of the most intimate parts of our agency, me deciding what really is Raymond Tallis, and what bits of it he's going to pursue and what bits he's going to forget, hopefully. So it shows the kind of internal muscularity the self has to shape itself, to manipulate what it counts as itself, its biography, and so on. All of that is central to the mystery of the self. Yeah.
Thank you. That was a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Elena's idea, maybe something will come up that we'll discover in neurobiology that'll explain the self. I think that's going to be difficult. Like I keep thinking of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, where the observer affects the outcome, and so you can never really get a sense of what's really going on without that influence of the observer. Yeah. And so we're trying to observe ourselves, which is going to make that, I think, impossible.
Yeah.
One of the things that I'm kind of wondering about, you were asking about, the body size and brain size, and and you're absolutely correct. Some of the explanation for why some creatures like birds, like particularly crows and ravens and magpies, are so smart, is because the density of the neurons. It's not the size of the brain, but how many neurons are packed in there, and then the synaptic connections between those neurons. And so when I'm thinking about how you define oneself, I get the sense that most of what's going on for me is actually unconscious. And so the sense of self is sort of an idea of where this is emerging from the subconscious. I guess this is why, psychiatrists think they have a really good job, that they can manipulate and find out things, which I kind of doubt. But I think what's going on is, if we're a moving feast, we rapidly lose memories that are not really important to us, or they don't have an impact on us. You show yourself at the end of the day a pile of dust, right? And you came from that dust in the first place, right? We rebreathe the carbon that other people have breathed, thousands of years ago, and from the things we consume from our animals and plants. But I wonder, is it that your impact is really more what you do to the environment? We shape our environment. That's one thing that I think that makes us different from many other animals. Other animals do have tools. They do build nests. They do create societies like termites and with large structures. But we do it very well, and I think it's kind of interesting. The concept of being able to use your hand basically allows you to then use tools, and that makes us much more efficient. Not necessarily the first, but very, very efficient at doing that. So I think as a life, we are shaped by our environment, but we shape our environment too. And as a society, we're shaping our environment. And I think that your contribution, even though you maybe end up back as a pile of dust, is like, little drops of water with waves, and they converge with other waves. You do shape the environment. Even after your death, you still, in a sense, live on that way. But I think I get the sense that self is just, it doesn't really exist. I think it's a moving fluid, time, space. And I think of people that are undergoing degenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's. It's more mobility of the body, and ALS. But with Alzheimer's, we feel as if that person is disappearing, just as they appeared as a baby. When a baby is born, it's got a certain amount of already behaviors formed in part by the inputs in the mother's womb. But there's a lot of development that goes on, and you take the extremes of what you're like as a baby, and you look at what you are, towards the end of your life, and they're completely different individuals. And I think that transition is going on continually. So it's hard to define self.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, in a way, Alzheimer's disease, because it is such an obvious tragedy, is a reminder of what a self is, because it's a reminder of what has been lost. That there's a kind of coherence in me before I have Alzheimer's disease than there will be, e.g., when I get it. So it is a reminder. I was very interested in your example of the birds and their skills. And of course, there's been a huge amount of work done on scrub jays and things, looking at their seeming capacity to plan for the future. And I was very interested, you said they've got this kind of skill, not because of the amount of the size of their brains, but by the way the neurons are stitched together and the complexity. But one of the problems I have with that is, if you look at the cerebellum, gosh, you know it better than I do, it's much more complex than the cerebral cortex. The connectedness is more complex. There are more neurons there, and it hasn't got a smidgen of consciousness or self-awareness. So it's quite difficult sometimes to translate levels of selfness and levels of consciousness and map that onto the neural structures, the neural networks. Yeah, sort of. There were many other things you said, and I haven't done your question justice. Yeah.
Thank you again for your talk.
Thank you.
From what you said, it reminds me of my reading of a philosopher called Bernard Stiegler, who also developed from Husserl's primary retention and secondary retention to talk about a theory of tertiary retention, which is the technological memory of society. Mm-hmm. And from that, he developed a critique of the current society about the contemporary computational system, a global computational system, where our thinkings or our thoughts are being controlled in a certain sense by the way that algorithmic governmentality controls our world. So his point is we are dissolving ourselves because of an increasing lack of conflicts that we engage ourselves in our dialogues with each other. And so that comes back to your topic about selves, because in his idea, or at least in his theories, we develop or we individuate ourselves based on our resolution of conflicts between our individual and the collectives that we belong to. So let's say I grew up in a conservative type of environment, whereas when I came to Vancouver, it becomes more like or at least my PhD supervisor is a leftist, which is the conflict that I need to resolve. And by resolving that, I grew in developing my self-identity. Yeah. So I'm just wondering if that, how you feel, how you would respond to like Stiegler's type of critique.
Yes, thank you. In fact, your question does link with a bit of the previous question, which I forgot to respond to, which is essentially the dialectic between the self and the environment and the circumstances. I mean, me making sense of what I'm up to now, depends on the very complex society that this is a part of. So there is definitely that dialectic. And actually, I wanted to respond on posthumous existence, because you never know what your posthumous effect is going to be. And I always think my model for the uncertainty of posthumous life is to look at a statue with some pigeon droppings on it. And you think, that's how I'm going to be remembered. There's a little fascinator of, what I mean? Anyway, but you're right. I mean, conflict is an element. I'm not so sure it's the sole element. There's a lot of time when we're cruising, when we're just observing, when we're just getting on with things. Of course, we're pushing and shoving against all sorts of things, even if it's only trying to get the washing machine to work or whatever. But I don't think it boils down solely to conflict, although it is a very, very important part of what's driven us collectively. Yeah. So your emphasis on that interaction, I'm completely by. Yeah.
Folks, I think we have time for just a few more questions. So for those of you who would like to ask, let's gear them up, and we'll hear from York.
Ray, thank you very much for the talk.
Thank you.
You know, it's quite over my head. However, I must point out to everybody that I'm a vascular surgeon. It sounds impressive, but really I'm a plumber. And Ray Tallis is an electrician as a neurologist. I had a thought about where does all this talk about self come from? So my question to you is, maybe self is not in the brain, but it's in the gut, the belly. And the reason I say this is because, like yourself, 2 days ago we came back on a cruise from England, so we were on a cruise to Norway, and during that time we suffered what all travelers have, and that is jet lag. And with jet lag, you are sleep deprived, and so it takes you quite a long time to adjust with your sleep patterns and things. But the other thing that really happens when you travel and get jet lag is that your gut resets. And so your gut is highly developed to have, to give the brain the idea that you're hungry, thirsty, and have bowel movements on a regular basis. And when you take a long trip and screw that all up, you're not only hungry in the middle of the night, but you need to have bowel movements in the middle of the night that you never used to. So maybe self is only a pleasurable time when in fact your gut is at rest and the brain is in the gut.
I couldn't agree with you more. You know, I mean, basically, there is gut lag, isn't there? I know exactly what you mean by gut lag. God, this is confidential, by the way. I hope it's not. But I completely. But there's a bigger question behind your very astute observation, which is essentially, as it were, the location of the self. To what extent one embodies, colonizes, haunts, is one's body, which bit of one's body what. And I mean, Elena and I were talking about embodied cognition, for example. Clearly, the thought that Paris is the capital of France doesn't have a location anywhere. But there are certain things like the body image associated with running for a bus. It's much more clearly located in the body. And there's a lot of philosophers who want to extend our sense of the location of the self beyond the brain, where it's been kept in prison for so long, and to extend it to the rest of the body. But behind your question is something that puzzles me a lot, which is, in what sense am I related to my body? I mean, my body is a stranger. It's sort of, I think, oh, that's what it's up to now. Like the gut, precisely that. So a lot of unfinished business, if it's not too determinate. Yes, not related to your original point, but there's a lot of unfinished business there. Yeah. So thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk.
Oh, thank you.
It's a little above my pay grade, too. I'm a humble palliative care doctor and deal with a lot of people at the end of life when they are really struggling with some of these issues of self, and especially patients with Alzheimer's and others, where I wouldn't say that their self has disintegrated, but it's not accessible to me. As it once was. The question that I have here in Canada, you may know we are really up against it in dealing with medicalized killing. And in British Columbia, we're up to almost 10% of all of our deaths being by lethal injection. In fact, in Victoria, one quarter in 2022, 12.3% of the deaths were by lethal injection. And so this idea of personhood and how we care for every member of the human family is really important. And this idea that somehow I authenticate myself and you, the rest of you, need to affirm that feeds into this supposed right to have the state kill me. So I'm kind of at a loss as to how to articulate some of this, how we all fit together in this, and how we treat each other and how we see each other. How do we do that in ways that are loving?
Yeah. Oh, thank you for that question. I've already had a conversation with Will and Nora about precisely that. I mean, declaration of interest. For many years, I was chair of something called HPAD, which is Healthcare Professionals for Assisted Dying. And those of us who support assisted dying are shocked by what's going on in Canada because the scope of it is way beyond what we would see as assisted dying. And what we support is individuals who are terminally ill, who have had good palliative care, who have unbearable suffering, and which isn't responding to any treatment, who have clear mental competence, who've been reviewed by 2 doctors, etc., etc. And that's the model that we have in Oregon. And Oregon is a worked example of what has, alas, I mean, what you say about Canada is even more shocking than I knew, but of how things work out quite well. You know, we haven't had an exponential rise in assisted deaths in Oregon. We haven't had people being lined up to be shot involuntarily. We haven't had a situation where palliative care has been undermined. And in fact, as you probably know, the Palliative Care Association in Oregon has now become very supportive of the original assisted dying bill, having, for understandable reasons, being opposed to it. So 1997, that bill came in, the bill we would like to come in the UK, and 24 years later, no, I can't do the sums, 27 years later, it looks as if what was hoped to be achieved for the bill has been achieved without any undermining of our value of people, in particular people who may feel vulnerable because they have disability and so on. But that's my position, and you know, I mean, it took me a long time to get to it. I was originally opposed to assisted dying for some of the implicit reasons. And then, in fact, I chaired a Royal College commission on it and came out with that conclusion, and then changed my mind and asked them to visit it all over again, which made me incredibly popular, as you may imagine. Yeah. So that's my position. But you know, thank you for raising it. It is deeply relevant. Yeah.
I'd just like to add that it's very interesting that in every jurisdiction where the patient has to have agency, which is what happens in Oregon and Washington, that the percentage of deaths rises a little bit, but just very incrementally. But where it's actually considered a medical procedure, where there's a lethal injection, every jurisdiction where it happens by lethal injection, it's taken off exponentially.
You're absolutely right. And I think the thing about Oregon, although there's only a small number of people who avail themselves of assisted dying, many of them, as it were, sign up for assisted dying as a kind of assurance, and it's incredibly reassuring to those people. They know they will not have indefinite, unbearable suffering if they don't want it. But that, to me, is the key thing. As far as I'm concerned, you and I are totally on the same page regarding that. Yeah.
Interesting in DC, with Tallis, there is some hospitals, they actually have lost the ability without funding the government if they don't offer.
I heard about that. I was shocked. Will told me. I was really shocked by that. That's outrageous. Yes. I mean, what's happened in Canada really was so disappointing for us in the UK, because people are now citing Canada as a case against the kind of bill we would like, the Oregon-style bill, and it gets very muddled. And the idea of, you know, slippery slope and all that sort of stuff. Well, I have to say the coefficient of friction on the slippery slope is pretty high in an appropriate legislature. Yeah.
Thanks. I think we're at the end of time.
Well, thank you very much. We have the room for a little bit longer, I take it. So please, you don't have to hurry out right away. There's still goodies left here. There's coffee left, and if you want to ambush Raymond with not answering the question whether the self actually exists or not, right, Steve? Then please feel free to do so for a bit and enjoy what is here. And thank you all for coming out. It's been wonderful. Hope you can join us for the next one.